We live in an age in which identity is supremely important. We live in the age of identity. Now, identity has always been important, obviously. People have always had identities, tribally, individually, um, nationalistically, whatever sort of identity. But there's a very special type of a flavour to our hunger for identity that has become apparent in the last, probably only in the last 10 or 20 years. And it is a real desperate craving to personally have an identity. Now, one way that doesn't sound particularly strange. In one way, that sounds um, like it should be. Of course, we take it for granted that the identity is the supremely important thing that everything else must build on, such that if we have the identity, then that's our only starting point. That's our passport to everything, really. Without that, we have no passport. We'll be refused entry. We can't even start in life. So from one point of view, the statement that I just made is so obvious as to not be worth making. But in another way, we can see, if we're not looking at things in this particular socially conditioned way, we can see that the hunger for identity is a pathology. It's a sign of that we're really, really lost, really, really unhappy. We're clutching at straws, and the identity we're clutching at is a straw. It can never be anything more than a straw. It's a straw identity. All identities are straw identities. It's kind of, you can't really expect anything more from them, really, because an identity is a label created by the thinking mind. How can we get so crazed about a label? Is the label everything? Maybe the label is everything. Probably the label is everything at this stage, I think, because we live in an era where the thinking mind rules supreme, and the thinking mind creates a world out of labels, and it creates us out of labels too. So possibly the reason why having an identity is so very important to us is because we're lost in hyper-reality, because we're now proudly living in a hyper-real world. The hyper-reality is a great thing to talk about. It's a lovely way of looking at things, and it's all the buzz. It has been all the buzz. But that could actually blind us to the fact that even though it's a fantastic philosophical subject to talk about, it's more than that. There's something very grim and matter of fact about hyper-reality, because we're living in the hyper-real world. It's de facto, it's happened. While we're talking about it, it's happened. And that's not quite so interesting. It's not interesting because the hyper-real isn't interesting. So the hyper-real is made up of signifiers. We have signifiers, and the hyper-real is a shortcut because we take the signifiers to be the same thing as what they supposedly signify. Only they're not. They have a reality of their own. And the idea that they signify something which is real is their justification for being there. If a signifier didn't have the justification of signifying something, it would become apparent as being something very useless. Something very useless indeed. Or empty indeed, maybe. Because what is the point of a signifier whose only point is that it signifies something when it doesn't signify something. What's that all about? So the hyperreal world implicitly justifies and validates itself by this assumed implication that it signifies something great, signifies something real. Whereas it doesn't, it's become disconnected from what it might have signified or what it pretends to signify. And it's like a soap bubble, completely hermetically sealed world of ideas or mental images that chase each other round in circles and which feed off each other in a loop. And there's nothing outside of that loop except, well, there's nothing outside of the loop when we're living in the loop, and we can't see the loop to be a loop because it doesn't say that it's a loop. It just, hyper-reality claims to be reality itself, which reality itself isn't a loop. It's open-ended. It doesn't feed on itself. It doesn't continually repeat itself. So reality is a much cooler thing, obviously. Hyper-reality is in the nature of a very cheap, tacky, cheesy gimmick. A very cheap gimmick that nevertheless fools us because it is done well. It's like a cheesy old gimmick that's done well. And when we're in it, we can't see that it's only a loop. We're caught up in a loop that's feeding off itself because it's got nothing else to feed on, because if it acknowledged anything else, it would be shown up for what it is, an imposter. So what we have here is a reality imposter. Like he's walking down the street, he says, "Hey guys, I'm reality. Get a load of me." And well, the way it happens is a little bit more insidious than that, but it's that basic idea. So when we're adrift in the world of the hyperreal, we're disconnected from anything that is real, naturally enough, and we're disconnected from who we are, because who we are is substituted for by a label, by an identity, by something that's by a mind-created signifier. Now, the fact that we have been surgically disconnected from anything real, anything open-ended, anything that isn't a tautological loop, leans heavily on us, because there is an all-pervading sense of meaninglessness and alienation just beneath the surface, and sometimes right up to the surface. Sometimes it is the surface, but most of the time, for most of us, it's beneath the surface. And as long as we live very superficially and skate along that surface, like the excellent skaters we are, we can carry on with our lives and not ever be consciously aware of the profound meaninglessness of the hyperreal world which we're inhabiting and which has provided us with our identity. But it's leaning on us all the same. And one manifestation of this could well be said to be our hunger for an identity, which seems to be a really defining thing about this current age, or this current era, even though it's not really long enough to be called an age or an era because it's only just a few decades, but still, who knows, it might be the start of a whole age with a capital A, lasting hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of years. It won't be much fun if that happens, but still it could well happen, because hyperreality is super stable. It has very great stability. It's like anything, when we learn to cheat or shortcut life and get the result, or what appears to be the result, as a result of doing no effort, making no effort, this is the same as a very bad habit. It's a very bad habit because it gives us the semblance of achievement without the work. And so the actual idea of doing work, I don't mean going to work and putting a suit and tie on, I mean psychological work, i.e. doing something that's unfamiliar or extending ourselves out of our comfort zones, the comfort zone of the unreal. Any thought of work becomes frightening to us because we've lost the capacity to work, to extend ourselves, to move beyond our unreal comfort zones. We've lost the capacity because we are now just another part of hyper-reality. We're now just the signifier for who we really are. Only it's not really a signifier because it doesn't point us in that direction. It points us away from that, disconnects us from that. So it's a false or deceptive signifier. And we don't see the identity as being a signifier because we've taken the shortcut of thinking that it really is who we are. It is very hard to argue that it isn't a great thing to be an identity. Given our way of looking at things, it's very hard to make that argument. People look at you and as if you lost their head, as if you're away with the fairies, because the identity is concrete, and if we say there's something better than an identity, something realer, something much more, something that partakes in life rather than being alienated from life, people would say, well, we would say, show it to me. Tell me about it. Define it. What is it? Where's the research? And we're getting all rational about it, and we want signifiers, essentially. We want some signifiers for it. But there are no signifiers for it that can do it justice. Because signifiers all belong to the world. They all belong to the framework, what's within the framework. And the framework is a mind-created thing. The signifiers belong to this world that we can say everything about, whereas reality itself is something we can't say anything about, but which is, notwithstanding, totally real. So we can't see how it would be a great thing, that we'd actually feel a hell of a lot better if we could stop identifying so much with our identities. We just can't see that. Alan Watts says somewhere that, and this was going back to the 50s, he remarks on our habit of not really thinking that anything is real or that our lives are real unless we can see a report about our lives, whether it's in the form of a picture that we've taken and put in a photo album, or whether it's seeing ourselves on the news in some, perhaps. So the ultimate example of this would be where we get to be a celebrity. So being a celebrity typifies this thing because a celebrity's got to be real because they're in the papers all the time, so they keep themselves real, or the papers, the media keeps them real. So that's a perfect example of how identity needs to be. It's something that's proven. It's something that other people have to know about and understand. So if I say, well, this is my identity, I say a thing, a generic thing that everyone already knows, so they know what I mean. That way my identity is meaningful, even though really I've just bought into a generic worldview which has got nothing to do with me, so it's not really meaningful. The only meaningful stuff in our lives is the stuff that we can't immediately demonstrate or show to other people, that we're not on the same page with other people, because when we're all on the same page, that page is the page of hyperreality. So we're all on the same page, but the page isn't really real. So that's no good. So when there's no one else on our page, the experiences that we have are not comparable. They are not something that we can convey in terms of language or explain or talk about. There's no way for us to make a system out of that, or to in any way to relate to it using the means of relating to things that we are given by language. I probably didn't say that in the best way, but the point of that is that if we were to relate to our lives in this kind of fresh way, that isn't stale and second-hand, what we'd see would be a complete surprise to us, and we'd have no way of categorizing it or knowing what's going on. But it'd be very interesting all the same. But it's obviously true that when we do have the experience of being who we are, living our lives, it isn't like that. It's something that we can tell everyone about. I can say, well, I did this, I did that, I went there, I spoke to such and such, and he said that, and she said that, and we launch into a whole narrative, into a whole network of things that isn't belonging to us, doesn't relate to us. It's just that's just the page that we're all on. That isn't a real page. So we make do with that. And if we were ever to see the actual direct reality of our lives, it would be a shock to us. And we'd be very alone with it in a way, because we couldn't tell anyone else about it, because it's not shared experience. You go and meet someone for coffee and you start telling them about it, if you're able, but maybe you can express it in some kind of way. You're going to get odd looks because you've just qualified as being a weirdo. So that's what it means to be true to who you are. It means being a total weirdo, which is of course fine, as long as you're not relying on getting validation every inch of the way from everyone else around you, because they ain't going to validate that. Obviously that's kind of a tautological statement. Obviously you're not going to get validation for being a weirdo, because that's what being a weirdo is all about. It's being totally devalidated, unvalidated. You're adrift in a world that's not going to ever validate you. And in as much as we have a habit for being validated, an addiction to being validated, that's extraordinarily painful, because we're going cold turkey in that case. Humanity is giving us the cold shoulder. All the doors are shut and we're no longer part of it all. But on the good side, the plus side of that is that we've actually become real, and we're no longer disconnected from ourselves. But even saying disconnected from ourselves is a kind of sloppy use of language, because who we are isn't an identity, so it isn't a self, and we can't be either connected to it or disconnected to it. So the whole thing about an identity, the thought-created identity, is that it's a very, very thin thing. It's infinitely thin. It has no depth. It just is what it says it is. It is what it says on the label it is. So the label might say, here's Joe, and here I am. I'm Joe. End of story. I'm Joe. Who's that? Oh, it's Joe. Who did that? Who's knocking on the door? Oh, it's Joe. That's it. That is end of story. That's what an identity is. There's no depth to it. Because if there was depth to it, there would have to be something that isn't Joe. I would have to be something that isn't Joe. The identity would have to be something that isn't the identity, and it can't do that, because the identity is only what it is. So we could try to explain this a little bit by saying that the way things are, the way reality is deep, in that nothing is what it appears to be. whatever we look at, when we look at it, when we really look at it, examine it, it reveals itself to be not what we thought it was initially. It opens up to us. And it doesn't open up to show something else that is then the real thing, because what it shows us in turn opens up to show itself to be not what we took it to be. It doesn't matter what we took it to be, it never is what we took it to be. And that's that's where the profundity and depth of life comes in, because it's not all a two-dimensional slideshow. And so if we can see that reality has this quality of being undefinable and infinitely deep, then when we consider what it means to be an identity, we can see that we're at odds with reality itself, because an identity is just a very static kind of a thing. It's just a label. There's nothing beyond what it itself claims to be. So what we are insisting that we are is vanishingly superficial, vanishingly trivial, and vanishingly tedious. And not only that, it's very, very vulnerable, very, very fragile, because there are vast currents in life the whole time that could show it up as being false. So we have to be fighting against those currents and trying to control the whole time and manage the whole time, so we don't get our identity shown up to be false or shown up to be a mind-created hallucination. So we're in a really, really awkward situation. We're living on the basis of this tedious, totally sterile idea that by its very nature, has to be disconnected and dissociated from anything real, if it's to function as if we can believe that this is who we really are. It has to be. And not only that, but we're continually driven to maintain it and validate it and protect it, and that means we're fighting a battle the whole time to say what is unreal actually is real. So that's a very stressful situation. It's also a kind of a meaningless situation that we have to kind of continually try to validate to ourselves and say that it isn't meaningless. And yet in this age of identity, that is what we're gunning for. That's what we really want. We want to have that identity. Okay, thanks for watching.